I understood what Britain stood up for, let's say, especially in World War One and World War Two, but especially in World War Two when Hitler was trying to cross the channel and come so close to this tiny island, and Churchill saw this threat coming before anybody else. I think BLM and Hope Not Hate and, let's say, extreme left-wing protests like My Vagina is Open for Refugees, these are recent manifestations of how far and radical these ideologies have taken hold.
All right, folks, this is Harris Sultan, and YouGov just recently published a new poll according to which 41% of Generation Z, ages between 18 to 27, express pride in their nationality. So only 41% are proud of their nationality, but half of them view their country as racist and are not proud of being British. Joining me is Nuriyah Khan. Nuriyah has her own wonderful YouTube channel, Holy Humanist. Nuriyah Khan, go and subscribe to the channel, and I'm sure you'll love her videos. Nuriyah, did you hear about this survey, and what was your gut reaction? And I don't think it's only limited to Britain. I think the situation is not much different in Canada or other Western democracies. Why do you think that is? Why are so many people so ashamed to be British while we have so many Muslims who are proud to be Muslims? They have these nurses who proudly boast about their anti-Semitism. You have doctors who proudly boast about their anti-Semitism. And there are so many terrorist attacks coming out of that religion. But despite all of that, they're not ashamed to be Muslims. But on the other hand, some of the best countries who have contributed immensely to humanity's advancement, but they're ashamed to be themselves.
Yeah, in fact, you could argue sometimes those terrible things that you mentioned make Muslims beat the drum harder of their
they become
pride.
Even more proud of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Or they double down on the pride, because I guess what do you really have if you don't have actual anything to show for it? Although many people are going to argue that the golden age and all these things are attributed to Islam, and Muslims have all of that.
Yeah, but that was a long time ago. Even if it was great.
And this and that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm okay with Muslims taking pride from the good part of their history. I think everyone should be. That's the whole point we're discussing. And no country or no civilization is immune from dark history, I'd say. Yeah. I don't think that. So everyone has done something, but by the standards of today, you shouldn't really boast about it. But why are Westerners, who are undoubtedly the most inclusive people, they have embraced people from other cultures, even from cultures who are hostile to them. And despite all of that, the young people of these countries, they still view themselves as embarrassing, as they shouldn't be proud of it. Why is that?
To answer your question that you initially started off with, it made me really sad when I heard that little tidbit of a statistic, and I was like, surely this can't be the case. But then, yeah, looking around and in my own experience, it really does seem to be the case, which, as I said, it makes me sad, because being part of a country, whether you are first generation immigrant, second, third, whatever, if you have eventually made Britain or this little island your home, you would think that you would take some form of pride in it, or at least in what it's accomplished, if not in the past, which, yes, we can discuss pros and cons of the British Empire till the cows come home or we're blue in the face. But I've changed my position on this as well, and it has some stuff to do with my education and me relearning things. But essentially, you ask yourself, was it a net positive or not? And again, people have various opinions on these. I'm not willing to get into that conversation right now, but there are massive things within British history, including during times of the Empire. And I think one of the major ones is like ending the slave trade as we know it, the transatlantic slave trade, how much money Britain put. And again, I know people are going to argue the opposite and say they only did it because it was a failing economy in itself and therefore they had to act. But no, after doing my own research, I will honestly say that looking at countries to this day that still exist, especially Islamic countries, and especially how slow and how late they were to the party to abolish slavery. I'm looking at you, Saudi Arabia, you, Mauritania as well. Still, like Sudan and Libya, I'd say, are not even clear of that. It just makes you be a bit proud of the efforts, the lives that were lost, soldiers, by British soldiers, and the maritime efforts and expeditions that were undertaken in order to stop slavery. So this is just one example. But essentially, there are so many little tidbits throughout the tapestry of what is British history that we can look to in terms of their contributions to the world and just to progress in general. And obviously, because of their cultural and historical connection to many countries, this manifested itself differently in those various colonies that they had. But essentially, what made me really sad is that in the education that I had, for example, and the way I see potentially family members of mine or young minds coming out of some of our top UK universities, they are almost being force fed this certain type of narrative, and you can call it like a kind of woke narrative. And I'll go into this
They're
in a
being
bit more detail.
brainwashed into hating themselves.
In a way, yeah, it's basically it's a concerted effort through schools, I would say, through universities at a really high level as well. But mainstream media has done its bit as well. Public sector, NGOs, their kind of policies that they adopt, they've all pushed this idea of white privilege, anti-racism, and a white fragility, that all the ills of the past would fall on Britain's shoulders to answer for, and they need to be responsible and perpetually apologetic. And that's why even terms that we use now, like the global majority, as opposed to ethnic minorities in the UK, which I don't necessarily disagree with because it is the global majority when you talk about those cultures and those people, but it's essentially trying to completely flip the narrative and do it in a way as to make it really dichotomize it into like white bad, any other skin color, and all other races good. It kind of hones in that notion that white people can't be racist, nor can they experience racism, but they're the ones who harbor extremely like racist and prejudiced attitudes towards others. And I honestly believe it's like this kind of almost neo-Marxist brainwashing, as you said, penetrating all elements of society. And what it seeks to do is effectively sideline all of those that think differently. And again, this is all kind of my own personal perceptions of what's happening, but I think BLM and Hope Not Hate and, let's say, extreme left-wing protests like My Vagina is Open for Refugees, these are recent manifestations of how far and radical these ideologies have taken hold. And the problem is that in many of these spaces, we find that kind of the torchbearers and the poster women for these ideologies are, let's say, white liberal women who are championing these ideas, or like women who are afforded these luxuries of a very good middle, let's say, middle class education, but yeah, even beyond that. And they're the ones who are really allowing these toxic ideologies to take hold in the same way that we see them defend Islam. And I'm sure you've seen them again, the same kind of protests out there for Islam as a religion of peace, and Islam is a religion, or the people who follow Islam are perpetually victimized, and we need to bend over backwards to accommodate them. And any other white person that says anything to the contrary is far right and is racist, even if they're doing it just to safeguard their own daughters or wives or sisters or mothers or what have you.
Why do you think that is? Is it some sort of a conspiracy? Or it's just the next evolutionary step in our civilization where people have realized that we have to be more self-critical? Or it's a bit of both?
Well, I'd always say, yes, there are elements of follow the money, and you'll see the kind of influence that has been penetrating this country for the past couple of decades. But again, you would think so, right? The self-preservation is what a society would like to hold on to. But that's why I say that it is this neo-Marxist attitudes that have taken hold, and they run so deep through all elements of society, and it's always the privileged classes that kind of get to champion these ideas and bring them to the forefront for the most part. If we talk about whether it's through academia being taught through the lens of, let's say, Orientalism, which is huge in the UK now, or just revisionist historical anti-colonial or kind of neo-Marxist attitudes at the top universities in the country, you are essentially producing young minds who have zero veneration for the country that they live in and are supposed to belong to. And that's extremely problematic. I have family members at some of these universities, and I see these exact attitudes like reflected in their thinking when I have conversations with them, when we are discussing the news, and you just see, okay, this is how this person was. They went to this university, and these are now the views that they hold. So it's almost like you're being told what to think and not how to think, which is extremely problematic. And again, I was a victim of this myself. I went to probably the most left-leaning university that exists in the UK. It was a Russell Group University, which is considered one of the top universities. And you can say that I asked for it though, so I'm not gonna say I
We're
went in
looking for that.
blindly, because yeah, it has got Orientalism in the name. It specializes in teaching everything but British history, to be honest, and it teaches you everything with a look of how can we frame this in a way that Britain has gone to X, Y, and Z place and essentially screwed it up. So we are taking back all like history as we know it, and we're understanding it from new angles. And that makes you naturally really have a sense of aversion for everything Britain once stood for and what it's done to those cultures. And for example, you studying laws and different legal systems because the British mind, without being in an institution like that, can't even conceive of laws that are non-European or non-British, if that makes sense. So yes, you're right. I did ask for it. I walked in there because I was a young radical mind. And that's the kind of university that struck with me, because I had come from the Middle East and it was the only one that had Arabic offerings and things like that. So that's why a lot of people who are interested in Islam or foreign cultures apply specifically to that university. But again, I could see exactly what it did to my mind as I came out and had years away from it. And you could see the funding of that university and where it comes from and who is gifting that university lecture halls and what have you. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is I didn't come out of that university with even an iota of a sense of pride. And I'm not just saying pride, I'm just saying, even in terms of fairness about, let's say, history from a holistic point of view, because as you said, no period in history is without its dark moments, but credit where credit's due, right? And I wasn't even giving Britain credit where credit's due. It was just constantly seeing it as the aggressor and as the perpetrator. And that was actually our starting point to study history. And I actually did law and economics. So, from an economic perspective as well, we only ever saw the ills of Britain basically throughout history, and especially in the Middle East, especially when studying South Asia. And as somebody from South Asian descent myself, it made me so angry. I remember sitting in that lecture hall and I turned to my fellow student, and she was from Nigeria, and we both realized it was a learning moment for me, because I realized what Saudi Arabia was doing in countries like Pakistan, but I also, from a Nigerian perspective, she realized how screwed over her country had been in the past as well. But we are never taught the opposite, and that's what's scary. It's just when you've got a force like that taking over your entire society for young minds, and then you've got mainstream media who barely show you the other side of things at play and are constantly denigrating the, let's say, native population forever, just stating their own views, or barely any coverage of anything remotely purely British, where Britain is celebrated and it's minuscule, one program for half an hour as opposed to dedicating a day for it or banging on about it on the news. You stop caring about things like that, and you just think that this is why people might have a lot of an identity crisis here, because what does it really mean to be British, and what is there to truly be proud of if you've not got a connection to World War II, or you've not got ancestors who fought for it? Are you even connected to World War II like memorials when they're on TV? But we all should be. You should care as much for what Churchill did when he said we'll fight on the beaches, literally stopping fascism in its tracks. You should care about that just as much. You should celebrate the fact that Britain fought, and we fought to such an extent, but it's completely overlooked now. And it's just, you're focused on things that are happening hundreds of miles away and sidelining all of these things in British history, which you wouldn't even be in that situation had it not been for insanely courageous events of the past, but they're just not taught in that manner.
By the way, go easy on yourself. I love that quote that if you're not a lefty Marxist in your 20s, then you have no heart. But if you're still a lefty Marxist in your 40s, then you have no brain. Just a quick search on this issue of Middle Eastern funding of Western universities. It says, according to a 2024 report of the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprises, Qatar has donated nearly $6 billion to US universities, while Saudi Arabia has contributed approximately 3.5 billion to US universities. These donations are part of a broader trend, with Arab nations collectively providing over 13 billion to American higher education institutions. The situation is not really that different in the UK either, although a little less sum than what they've been donating to American universities. 2024 article from aish.com highlights that Arab states have made substantial donations to British universities, with a consortium of 12 Muslim nations jointly funding Oxford's Islamic Studies Centre to the tune of £75 million. Additionally, Cambridge University's chair of Arabic is funded by the Sultan of Oman at a cost of $5 million, and Exeter University's Islamic Studies Centre has received millions of pounds over the past 25 years of Sheikh of Sharjah. Where these millions of pounds going, and what's their purpose to donate this money to Cambridge University's chair of Arabic? What do they need £5 million for? What is that money for? It looks like the university just saw money's coming in, so we look the other way. Money's good. And to make matters worse, the authorities also did not do anything about it. Surely there should be some sort of checks and balances. I remember a few years ago, there was a massive controversy here in Australia. They discovered that some of the Australian universities, they were taking in donations from the CCP. And it's always done in the name of improving
Wow.
relations or educating Australian public about the Chinese culture. And it always appears soft and harmless. But surely when you're dealing with billions of dollars...
Chinese expansionism always does, though. Be careful with that.
Yeah, so
you guys are very close as well, and they've already got quite a lot of hold of your country. So I would say,
so
be very careful with that.
Yeah, so all of these things are happening and nothing was done. And now people are scratching their heads and they're wondering, why do we have this sudden outburst of Islamist ideas in our university campuses? And we have blue-haired wokies as the biggest defenders of these Islamist values. It's mind-boggling how these people who champion women's rights, who champion LGBTQ rights, they are siding with people who are the most homophobic, who are the most misogynistic, and they don't even try to hide it. They say it boastfully that this is how Islam treats women and LGBTQ people, and this is how it should be, and that's how you create everlasting societies. And they point out the demise of the West, and they blame these progressive ideas. So why are you siding with those people? Because they're ideologically opposed to the world that you want to create.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because that's what I'm saying. These kind of women, or these, let's say, these hardcore wokies, they are coming out with nothing but like this sense of revenge and retribution that they want on the West in their respective countries. And so they will take up ideas like absolutely championing and being torchbearers to defend things like mass migration. And as I said earlier, like believing Islam is a victimized religion of peace. I would also say they take up forms of toxic feminism. And the reason I use the word toxic is because they genuinely see, as you said, the West as like the root of all evil and as the real oppressive patriarchal force. So again, this is why I really think this is the neo-Marxist view to destroy society as we know it, because they are defending views. For example, they're not being gender critical in some instances, or in all instances, which strictly speaking, in my opinion, may not actually be in the interest of women, yet they champion it. It is in feminist interests, if you think about it rationally, to be gender critical, and yet they're just not. When we talk about violence against women and girls, which, as I've mentioned for the umpteenth time in all of my videos, the UK government has decided to treat this as a national emergency on the same level as terrorism. So you would imagine that women organizations, and when I say that, they're like most women-led, so they're by women and for women. We call them by and for organizations. They spend so much of their time and policies and agendas on anti-racism and how the system is skewed against women from ethnic minorities. And they used to call them BAME, so Black and Ethnic Minority Women. We don't use the term BAME anymore, which I'm grateful for, but what if we replaced it with global majority, which is even more alarming, even though, yes, it is the global majority, but, you know, it really lends itself to identity politics.
Why do they do that? Why do they separate people? I mean,
Well, but it runs back to that the white women are come from a place of privilege. So we need to focus on the fact that these women are different. They're from the global majority because, hey, don't call them minority because they're only minority on this tiny island, but actually they dominate most of the world. So who are you to call them a minority? This is how deeply ingrained this thinking is into how bad the West is and like how they are culpable for so many crimes, and now we have to flip the narrative. So just so I don't forget, my point here is that, again, I want to caveat what I'm saying with what they've done. And when they say the system is skewed towards protecting these women and therefore we need to do extra, yes, I agree that there are obstacles and added barriers to, let's say, women from various backgrounds who are in this country accessing support services, whether that's due to language barriers, whether that's due to their culture or religious sensitivities, what have you. Yes, that's why intersectional feminism is important, because a woman from a different culture has different obstacles to accessing support and therefore attaining equality. That's completely fine. But what they do is they spend so much of their time in focusing on policies like this and these kind of women, I would say at the detriment of white, specifically working class women. And that's why, for me personally, the Grape Gang scandal, I'm saying that so your channel stays afloat, but the Grape Gang scandal and cover up was so like personal to me, is because working in the Vogue sector, I didn't see almost any Vogue organization put a statement out about the whole scandal and the cover up. In fact, what I did see was an organization come out and say that anybody talking about this, for instance, who was one of the biggest kind of people to blow the lid off on this, Tommy Robinson, whether you love him or loathe him, he was one of those people. They actually did an article saying how the fact that Tommy Robinson is focusing on white working class women being abused and this being covered up, that he is actually stoking class differences and causing civil unrest by doing it and turning this into a class struggle. So, for example,
so when
in
they're
a
doing it, it's
situation like,
okay, but when he points out, then he's stoking class differences.
even, okay, we've taken the caveat that statistically women from other ethnicities and, let's say, different cultures are statistically less likely to report abuse or crimes, domestic violence, whatever. But
Because
when
of
it
their
comes to
cultures. So let's blame their
incidents, yeah,
culture.
yeah, exactly. Or whatever other things like language barriers and things like that, natural obstacles to obstacles to accessing support. But when it comes to real Vogue, violence against women and girls, when white women are involved, the victims are white women and girls, the charities are almost stum, like absolutely stum on that issue, because they would rather call Tommy Robinson a kind of disruptor and more focus on his links to the EDL, as opposed to doing what they are set up to do, which is to safeguard women and girls, just because the victims, in that case, the victims, survivors, do not fit their narrative of having crime perpetrated against them. So, in this entire kind of point in history that we find ourselves in, where these insanely woke neo Marxist attitudes have penetrated all elements of society, even organizations which you think would be immune to this, like organizations by and for, that's why I mentioned by and for, when you, all you should do is safeguard women, whether they be black, Chinese, white, brown, I don't care, regardless of where they're from. That should be your goal. But yet you are silent on those matters, and yet you publish and you go out to protest on stand up to anti-racism and hope not hate and all non-gender critical theories you'll stand by, but you won't protect white working class women of this country. And I know, sorry, this goes very far from your initial question, but it's just gone so far to say that we're given so much airtime and privilege, and we care so much about what color your skin is in this country and potentially the harm done to you because of that, as opposed to we're all on this island together and let's make the best of it and protect each other equally. When we should be championing safeguarding women equally, all this attention, while I understand there are obstacles, as I mentioned, there are, and we need to focus on them separately, but the amount of airtime that is skewed towards the global majority now, vis-a-vis genuine, some of the most vulnerable women in society are working class white girls, but they're not given the same treatment. So yeah, it's literally penetrated every single sector.
You said that Britain is just obsessed with the color of people's skin and everything has become a race issue. But it's amazing how people who don't subscribe to this Marxist anti-racism ideology seldom complain about racism. I've spent most of my life in Australia. I've never really witnessed racism the way they're saying it. I'm not saying that there is no racism at all, but what I'm saying is that it's definitely not as big of an issue as they make it out to be. It's kind of similar to people who don't believe in ghosts. They never complain about getting possessed by ghosts.
Yeah, no, exactly. If all is color, then you're going to make everything about color because that's
Yeah.
what, and again, it's confirmation bias. But let me just also say that's why I think it's encouraging when some politicians are looking towards the USA now and whether you again like him or loathe him, the Trump
Donald Trump.
effect, just back like taking a bit of a backseat on not taking a backseat completely, getting rid of it altogether. DEI has really infiltrated this country in a very bad way. This has all lent itself to what I've been describing. So when you mentioned the combination, or when you asked why, it's a combination of kind of all those factors. And then you mentioned the funding as well. Like the university I went to, was parts of it were funded massive, huge gifts from the Sultan of Brunei. So go figure. It's all of this cumulative effect that has been going on for so long that I think it's affected almost like a generation or two. And so we're going to need to do a lot of kind of backtracking and build this sense of pride and what it means to be British, and genuinely like the baseline of what British values are. Because what does it mean to be British? Again, we can argue that till the cows come home and everyone will have their own idea of what it does mean. But essentially, what we're talking about is a set of values. I know you hinted at it earlier, but people who absolutely have no intention to share your values, those are people who will never consider themselves British. And so that's like problematic elements of society that we're going to need to look into, because if those kind of ideologies are left to manifest and run rampant, then that's never conducive to a high trust society, which ultimately everybody wants at the end of the day. Yeah, even like in school, for example, I'm not saying I know completely firsthand what it's like to go through the school system here, being in this country, because I went to British schools, but I went to international ones. And thankfully, when I was taught history, I understood what Britain stood up for, let's say, especially in World War One and World War Two, but especially in World War Two when Hitler was trying to cross the channel and come so close to this tiny island, and Churchill saw this threat coming before anybody else, whereas a lot of the other politicians were dismissing him. But little things like that, these tiny snippets of history that I think most of Gen Z now would never really even care for or care to take a minute to think about. And with the last kind of World War II memorial that took place, it was really heartbreaking to think that by the next one, most of the veterans from World War II, we won't really have any living veterans left. I think there was a handful that attended it. So again, this is now going out of our living collective memory, and we can't allow that to happen. So we need to keep drumming in things that it's not bad to, in schools and in on national days and on days that are meaningful, to hone in the point that this is what's important and this is what this country stood for in this moment of time, and this is why you're here today enjoying the very freedoms that allow you to call for the entrance and existence of people that shouldn't be here at all. And I'm sorry, it's been long-winded, but what I'm trying to say is it's been looked down on and it's been frowned upon to be proud of being British and to celebrate Britishness and to hold up the Union Jack and talk about
People have been
Winston
jailed
Churchill
and
in a
fined for
positive
it.
light. Yeah, absolutely. And even to talk about Winston Churchill, first, other people would say you have to accept that he was racist and Victorian in his attitudes. And some people said, go as far as to say he caused the Bengal famine, and complete nonsense, in my opinion. But to say things like he was Victorian in his attitudes, of course he was. He was like born in the Victorian era. Of course he's
Yeah.
going to have some Victorian attitudes. But he also saved us from one of the biggest existential threats of that time. So again, it's like the net positives that we're not even allowed to take away of British culture. They've been repressed for so long. I think it's time to celebrate those again and
Yeah.
yeah, put them back into the mainstream.
A lot of these lefty extremists are now actually asking for Churchill's statue to be removed from Trafalgar Square.
Yeah.
So human beings are ideological creatures. So I think it matters what ideology are they being brainwashed with. And it's amazing that the moment you let go of these hateful ideologies, like you and me, all of a sudden we don't feel any hatred towards Jews. All of a sudden, we don't feel any hatred towards the West because we don't see the West as a competing ideology or a competing form of government that is encroaching on our form of government, which is Sharia. Yeah, it's quite sad actually.
I
And
low-key always preferred it. That's why Islam never sat right with me, but here we are.
yeah, but that's why we say chickens for KFC. It just doesn't make any sense that a lot of Muslim women actually don't like the Taliban or ISIS, but at the same time, they don't like the West either, which allows them to attack the Taliban and ISIS kind of governments. It's so paradoxical. Again, it's just because they just can't let go of Islam. One thing Islam has been really successful in is its ability to stranglehold people's thoughts, that they just can't let it go without at least having a serious identity crisis. But it's not really impossible. Look at you and me. It's not really that difficult. And as I said, once you let go of that, you don't have to hate the LGBTQ people. You don't have to hate the Jews. You don't have to hate the West. You don't have to make your life miserable in search of a quest that is probably never going to be realized, which is to establish Sharia in the West. I hope so. Sometimes they do look.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. All right, this is it from us. Subscribe to Holy Humanist. That's Nuriyah Khan's YouTube channel. And I'm sure you'll find a lot of amazing videos on these topics. Until next time, ta-da.
If you like these videos and want to support me in my activism, then you can support me on Patreon or PayPal. Stay free, everyone!